All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this week's regional report. Great topic today, a resurgence of U.S. manufacturing. We have a great panel coming up, over 500 RSVPs for this event. So definitely getting ready for an exciting discussion. My name is Eric Sperling. I'm the managing director here at the Social Television Network. If you're not familiar with STN, we are a local streaming network based here in downtown Phoenix. You can find us on the App Store. All of our local shows and segments are dedicated to local leadership, community growth, and actionable solutions. And that is where our partnership with GPEC developed, and their president and CEO, Chris Camacho, who we will be hearing from in just a moment. If this is your first time joining us for the regional report, we do want to get to some logistical housekeeping items. Today's webinar will last for about an hour. Audience members will be muted and without video. We want to remind everyone that the webinar will be recorded and be shared on the GPEC website and social media. So there's a lot of slide presentations coming up. Don't worry, those will be available as we're recording this. You can submit questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, but again, due to time constraints, we just might not get to all of those questions. And should you experience any technical difficulties at all, recommend doing what you do all the time, just log off, log back in, and that usually fixes the problem. And we do invite you to share this information on social media. Please feel free to tag GPEC and use the hashtag Greater Phoenix Together where appropriate. Okay, while we welcome everybody in here, I want to remind people that the next regional report will be, needs to actually be a two-part series. May 20th at 2 p.m. We're going to bring together an esteemed panel of leading investors that will provide perspective on how this pandemic has impacted their investment decisions and what startup and early stage companies can do to weather the storm. Then on May 28th, we will have 4 Greater Phoenix-based businesses and or nonprofits present their technology and highlight how they have pivoted their operation to meet the current demands of the COVID-19 pandemic. And now these businesses will be vying for a $50,000 grant provided by the PayKiss Center for Business Philanthropy and the Arizona Community Foundation. So we encourage audience participation, and you must register for each webcast separately. Okay, that's coming up next week. Today, let's talk about our 4 panelists. We'll start off with, as always, Chris Camacho, President and CEO of GPEC. We'll have Greg Healy. He is the Senior Vice President of Labor Analytics and Supply Chain Solutions over at Colliers International. Paul Laudicina, he is the Partner and Chairman Emeritus at A.T. Kearney. Luis Ramirez, President, Ramirez Advisors International. But first, as I mentioned, let's send it over to Chris now for an update on our economic status here in the Greater Phoenix area. Chris?
Great, thanks, Eric, and thanks to the panelists for being here. Luis, it's great to see you. Also, our days go back probably over, 15, 18 years back to our days in Yuma, working on border issues. So thanks to all of you for being here. So obviously, it's a very critical, important topic for the country and certainly for the state of Arizona and our region, in that global manufacturing is an important node of any healthy economy. And you hear terms like tradable sectors, base industries, and there's a lot of speculation within the COVID environment as to whether supply chains will forever be changed. So I look forward to hearing from each of the respective experts as they cover that today. So first and foremost, as I look on the horizon, I did a lot of interviews today regarding consumer confidence, and there's this kind of beginning stages of reopening various economies, and how consumer confidence plays into our recovery is so significant. And there's conversations about the demand side curve, how revenue will be generated to help not only small businesses, but enterprise users going forward. And as we look at consumers and ultimately business confidence, with COVID, there's no question that unequivocally supply chains will be changed. The redundancy of supply chains is going to be critically important as companies are evaluating risk as even a higher priority, meaning where their products come from, the sensitivity of timing on those products. I know that the Reshoring Institute recently came out with some data that referenced over half of those respondents were confident they would see some reshoring activity in the short term. And a lot of that's about, almost hyper regionalizing manufacturing to where point of good sale occurs and or supply chain partners are located. And so if you look at the continuum of the last kind of 10 years, as someone who works as an architect on the economy, we've seen international and specifically foreign direct investment be a very critical aspect of the U.S. economy. And we're no different in the state of Arizona. And if you look at the last recession, you saw material changes in the recovery where which I say leading up to the tax plan that was passed by Congress and signed by the president that created a more competitive U.S. tax environment. And immediately following that, you had pretty significant growth really from 2010 to 2018 in both some reshoring percentages and foreign direct investment value. Now, what occurred really in the last 2 years was uncertainty with the trade war in China and the back and forth on the tariff strategy for the U.S. led to, in our view, I'd love to hear the panelists' view on this, but really there was a massive amount of capital stagnation that occurred because of the uncertainty of the kind of moving target on tariffs. If you fast forward to today, and as I mentioned, the COVID implications, there's no reason why Arizona and our partnership with Mexico and even arguably larger parts of Latin America and California, believe it or not, we can partner with California. As this evolves, this should be the new America's triangle for global trade and manufacturing. Leveraging the supply chains that exist in northern Mexico and Sonora and Baja and deeper into the heart of Mexico, coupled with the consumer base and supply chain that still exists in California, coupled with a lot of the labor attributes, modern infrastructure attributes, and really talent base of this region. I do believe you're going to see geopolitics evolve where there's going to be a prideful positioning of a made in, pick the country, made in America, made in the UK, made in all these foreign markets, which will likely change how we've operated in the last 30 to 40 years with globalism. And so with that kind of geopolitics framework, I do feel like Arizona could be very well situated post-COVID, partnering with our neighboring states and countries to create really a global manufacturing powerhouse. So industries like med device, industries that have adjacency to national defense, industries like the semiconductor sector, there are a massive number of industries that have value-laden goods that could potentially reshore to the United States. But I want people to realize, at least my view of this, is that reshoring won't be massive amounts of significant job creation. I believe you're going to see mechanization. You're going to see certainly automated manufacturing facilities come back likely to the U.S. in some form, but they won't be as labor laden as what we saw in the 60s and 70s. And as a byproduct, if you look at price index against, say, China or other Asian markets, on average, 20 to 30% just labor cost differential, that's really begun to change. But there's still, if you actually compute the total cost of operations in the U.S. and factoring in all the various facets of operating costs in the U.S. is becoming increasingly competitive as our emerging market, I don't want to say competitors, but emerging markets evolve and have their effects occurring in their own respective markets where pricing has increased. So I'm really eager to hear from Luis and Paul and Greg, whom I've got to know over the years, and just certainly admire your respective views of international commerce. But I am really optimistic about the near-term opportunities for Arizona and really our binational partnership with Mexico, because we could really position ourselves very, very favorably, taking advantage of all the assets that exist in the Southwestern Americas region here. So with that, Eric, I'll kick it back to you, and I'll stick around for questions at the end, but thanks for everybody watching today, and thanks for the panelists for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And when we get to Q&A, let's make sure some of those questions you had, I'd love to hear the panelists respond as well. So remind me if we don't get to some of those. Let's transition over now to Paul Laudicina. Paul is Chief Executive Officer of Global Counsel LLC, a senior executive leadership coaching service, Chairman Emeritus of AT Kearney, and founder of its Global Business Policy Council. Mr. Laudicina is the author of a number of articles and books on global strategic issues and the author of a regular Forbes.com column on leadership issues. And he also hosts a popular podcast series, Coronavirus, A World Transformed, which features interviews with global leaders on the impact of COVID-19. So with that introduction, Paul, let's kick it over to you and talk about the impact that you're seeing.
Okay, thanks very much, Eric, and thanks, Chris. Great pleasure to be with you this afternoon. And I want to echo a number of the points that Chris has already made, because I think we need to put the future of manufacturing discussion in context of certainly of the global pandemic, but also with background of what I believe has been a fairly dramatic rethink by major global companies of global supply chains that had already been substantially underway pre-COVID-19. Essentially, this strategic shift, if you will, was a pre-existing condition. In fact, some 5 years ago, I published a white paper entitled From Globalization to Islandization. I remember well delivering the results of that research on the changing nature in global supply chains and business environment in a speech at the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum in Davos, and it was met with a great deal of skepticism. Everybody thought that integration and globalization was inevitable, and it was one of those things that was just a fact of life. But I explained a number of factors which I think are worth reiterating here this afternoon. First, cross-border friction from rising populist anti-trade sentiment was having an impact on global supply chains and how companies thought about it. The resurgence of nationalist industrial policies, where governments were increasingly seeking to boost their country's competitiveness by promoting, often demanding, local sourcing and production in return for market access. There was also this fear post 9/11 that there'd be another interruption in trade as a result of a terrorist attack or regional or global conflict that gave people some concern about the integrity of the global supply chain. And then, of course, there was the reduction in production costs attributable to greater automation, which has diminished the importance of labor arbitrage. And we saw that having a real impact on flows of foreign direct investment. These so-called fourth industrial revolution technologies, which were changing the whole nature of the competitive environment. And finally, the growing consumer demand for customized and personalized products, requiring all of these conditions, requiring that global supply chains would be reorganized with centers of manufacturing closer to the end consumer of the market being served. And this has led to a shift in strategy from what had been, for the better part of the last half century, this continued aggressive global integration and the development of global supply chains to what we called in a study we released 2 years ago, the new era of multi-localism, characterized by shifting, devolving, and decentralizing management, operations, supply chain production, and marketing of products geared to appeal to local markets. And I think the trends that I'm going to talk about are not only reflected in the research that Kearney has done, but if you look at the National Association of Manufacturing, or you look at the Global Business Alliance, or you look at the Bank of America survey, they're all pointing in the same direction. And I think all of these conditions are bringing us to this new sort of multi-local world. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is a kind of one-size-fits-all business model, nor that it has been in any way universally or even uniformly adopted. However, all of the companies that I'm working with will have at least begun adjusting to these new realities by doing two different things. First, recalibrating their global footprint based on this reassessment of the markets that they have to play in, their core markets, and a realignment of their global supply chain to adapt to these new market localization pressures that I had just referred to. And then secondly, they're developing what I like to call a market-specific sensory perception to be aware of local conditions and requirements that shape and that need to be shaped and adapted to enhance corporate presence to meet local market needs. So this shift from global supply chains to multi-localism was boosted further by the dramatic increase in trade frictions between the U.S. and China, as well as with other trading partners. And that further shift in global supply chains is reflected in our 2019 Kearney Reshoring Index. So if we could bring up the first slide, please. This study that we've done for the last 7 years is available to anybody that wants to go to the Kearney website, just kearney.com, and you'll see it in its entirety. But we just released these results that I'm going to speak to today last month. And if you'll go to the first figure, the next slide, you'll see that it shows that U.S. companies last year sourced fewer manufacturing goods from the 14 low-cost Asian countries, the principal one, of course, being China, than at any time in the 7 years that we've been publishing this index, largely attributable to this more mercantilist, if you will, trading environment. And here we see that the U.S. market imported just 12.1 cents worth of offshore production from these 14 low-cost Asian countries for every $1 of manufacturing output. You'll see this on the next slide. Which is nearly a full percentage point decrease in corresponding imports from the previous year. So what you see here on this slide is a reshoring index of a score of 98 for 2019, which is the highest yet registered on this index. The previous high you could see was 11 basis points in 2011, with a low of a negative 112 basis points recorded as recently as 2015. So what does all this mean? You'll see on the next slide that the value of manufactured imports from Asian low-cost countries fell 7%, from $816 billion to $757 billion over the last year. But this contraction is almost exclusively driven by the collapse in imports from China, which declined 17%. At the same time, that second line, that black line you'll see, shows how U.S. manufacturing gross output held steady from 2018 to 2019. So despite this generally favorable index result, not all the news is positive for U.S. manufacturing. The limitations which held manufacturing growth flat in 2019, even as the trade war with China put Chinese manufacturing at a disadvantage, I believe will continue to dampen a significant revival in U.S. manufacturing until such time as those issues are addressed. What are those limitations? I think we all know them well. There is a pronounced shortage of skilled labor. I think we can remove this slide now. My slides are completed. There's a pronounced shortage of skilled labor, especially in the very high-tech segments of the market that the U.S. needs to capitalize on. Secondly, this long-promised productivity boom via automation just simply hasn't yet materialized. The labor productivity index for manufacturing, which grew quite steadily between 1997 and 2010, has been flat. It's been stagnant since then. Further, even with automation, the cost of domestic production is still often higher than that of Mexican or Asian based companies. And of course, unemployment pre-COVID-19 was at a record low of 2.9% in 2019, which continued this 10-year tightening or contraction of the manufacturing labor market. And as a result, companies have struggled to operationalize their reshoring aspirations or intentions. And if you just look at the example of Foxconn, which recently slowed and then revised its planned $10 billion flat screen LCD factory in Wisconsin, and they cited labor shortages, so they finally sort of just reoriented to build a lower tech plant on the same site. Now, what's the good news that I leave you with? The good news that 70% of manufacturers reported that they were creating or expanding their internal training programs, even though, despite that, the Manufacturing Institute still predicted that there'd be a 2.4 million worker shortage, as particularly in the high-tech, manufacturing sector by 2028. So there'll be a continuing tight market for labor, again, pre-COVID-19. Another index that Kearney publishes every year, we've been doing for the last 20 years, called the Foreign Direct Investment Confidence Index, which is a forward-looking indication of how Global 1000 CEOs intend to invest in the coming years. And the good news there is that the new result will come out next month, in fact, but the last 7 years, the United States has been in the #1 position as the most favorable destination for foreign direct investment. It overtook China back in 2011, and it has held that position steadily after China had been in that #1 position for almost a decade until 2011. And China has continued to sag, but the U.S. has maintained that steady position, #1 position. So the real question that I leave you with is, will the U.S. be able to translate what is a generally favorable global environment and the real investor interest that is manifest in the U.S. to both substantial increases in reshoring of manufacturing, as well as the lion's share or a dominant share of new foreign manufacturing direct investment. And that will simply be a function of how smart the public and the private sector is in cooperatively addressing both the labor and high-tech infrastructure requirements, which all investors tell us will be the most important preconditions for their investment decision-making. Thanks very much.
Yeah, Paul, all great information. We have some questions that have been submitted already. We're going to bring you back in just a few moments, pose some of those questions to you. But again, thank you for all that great information now. As we transition over to Greg Healy, Greg leads the supply chain and logistics consulting team over at Colliers International. Over 20 years of global manufacturing and supply chain experience. Greg bridges the world of distribution with the world of real estate solutions. Previously, Greg held the positions of Vice President for Honda Logistics, President Smart Turn Logistics. So Greg, let's give you the floor now and talk about the impact that you're seeing.
Great, thanks. Great comments both from Chris and Paul, and I'm going to echo some of them in my slides I'd like to share with you guys today. So Bethany, if you'd like to cue up the slides, please. And as she's doing that, I just want to, again, as we talk about this concept of reshoring manufacturing jobs in the United States, I want to look at historically, how have we done as a manufacturing country, and where are we going, and where have we trended? So in this slide here, I just took some data and I was comparing manufacturing levels in 2010 to 1946. We had roughly the same amount of people in manufacturing in 1946 as we did in 2010. So you can, despite huge increases in population growth, the number of people in manufacturing has not grown significantly. We see it going up slightly from 2010, which is interesting because it parallels the growth of e-commerce to a big degree. The points I've noted here on this slide are that you see the decline in manufacturing in the United States pretty much from 1978, which parallels again when Nixon opened up China so we see China joining the World Trade Organization. We see NAFTA 1994. You see opening of Vietnam 2001, and you see a steady decline of manufacturing jobs in the country. We were at a point in the country where we had 23% in 1978 of our population involved in manufacturing. Today it hovers around 8%. And you can see in the last little edge of this slide here how this is most recent information, the huge drop off in manufacturing since the COVID-19 pandemic. Next. So from 2010, we've seen an increase in reshoring activities. And I joined Colliers in 2016, coming from the user side of the business, coming from Honda Logistics and having my own 3PL business. We are very interested in global supply chains and how we manufacture and support clients globally. And this also quite clearly reflects a similar sort of concept and similar understanding with other manufacturers. If you look at since 2010, which states have been the biggest states to gain additional jobs in reshoring activities, it's surprised to see South Carolina is #1, quite substantially higher than #2, which is Tennessee, Michigan, Georgia, Alabama, North Carolina. And of these reshoring activities, what's interesting to note is that the majority of jobs that are being reshored are related to transportation. So they're either aircraft or they are automotive industries that are reshoring these jobs, specifically since 2010 to 2018. In my role with Colliers, what we're doing is we're helping some of these clients globally look at locations to put manufacturing facilities in the United States. And quite commonly, we find similar sort of drivers are actually encouraging people to go to the similar locations. So what's important to them? First of all, if you look at the population of the United States, 2/3 west of the Mississippi, 1/3 east of the Mississippi. You look at proximity to markets. And so if you're in, you have a lot of population in the Northeast and plus the growing population in the Southeast, you see it makes a pretty compelling reason to go to those markets. Also, right to work states. We have a questionnaire our clients go through, and one of the important questions they like to answer is it a right to work state or not? And if it is, if it isn't a right to work state, sometimes it's immediately taken off the list of potential states to consider for manufacturing facilities. Low cost and of course available labor is highly critical. Pre-COVID-19, as Paul alluded to, with extremely low unemployment levels, it was a real deciding factor. We could do tons of analysis of where to locate a facility, but if the labor wasn't there, you couldn't execute on that plan. Also, port access, if you're bringing in global supply chain or if you're exporting products globally, you need to have access to ports. So these were the areas which I think are interesting. And I think going forward too, we will still see growth in these markets here, but also what I think is the shift with COVID-19 is this reshoring opportunity. And the reshoring opportunity says people are considering a China plus one model. Let's go to the next slide. And so, we look at COVID-19, first we say it was a medical pandemic, but really it became a supply chain pandemic. And we had a huge fluctuation in the demand and the supply side of economics here. So we see retailers and hospitality first being very severely hit, employment and also warehouses and ports. And as it goes on further and deeper, you're finding that all of these things really are related to how we get our goods and services. And so supply chain has been a huge focus. Specifically, there have been some huge losses of jobs. And Goldman Sachs said they were expecting 16 million people unemployed by Q2 of 2020. That number is even higher than that now. But other industries are growing. Other industries such as companies like Instacart, Walmart's looking to hire 150,000 people or more. We have, of course, Amazon, Target's, a lot of these CVS and medical companies looking to hire people. So we see a pivoting of what people are looking for and what sort of jobs are needed in the near term. And so with this COVID-19 pandemic, what we found on the supply chain side is that companies looked at how they were sourcing products and they said, hey, all my eggs are in one basket. And click on the animation, please, for me. And surprise, surprise, that basket's also made in China. So they said, how do we deal with this? And China's been pretty quick to recover from this, relatively speaking. I mean, they have a lot on the line because this made in China powerhouse, which they are as a brand, with a greater population of people in manufacturing than double the size of California alone, they have a lot to lose from this. And prior to COVID-19, with the pressures from the Trump administration with tariffs, and of course the inflation and other pressures in China as well, we saw companies looking at diversifying their supply chain and going into Southeast Asia potentially, or potentially moving into Latin America. But now this is a catalyst to really further promote this shift and change. So I think what I've been hearing a lot is companies are saying in the short term and the long term, what's the plan? Changing very complex supply chains is not something you can do easily. You have to look at how do you find new suppliers in different markets. And as Paul alluded to, and in my experience at Honda as well, after we had the earthquakes and we had tsunamis and we had all these challenges with flooding in Thailand, we created a globalization model that was globally localizing our supply chains. So we'd have supplier bases in the markets where consumers were, but we had redundancies built in other markets as well, so we could flex. I think that's really the trend we're going to see more. And some of these, the winners of this will be those locations which are close to low-cost labor as well as accessibility to markets. Next. So this is the key word I hear so much. This is every conversation I'm in, people are talking about the resilience of supply chain. How do you make anti-fragile supply chains? And as I mentioned earlier, we had the risk prior to COVID-19, but this has all accelerated this transformation. And a report today from Thomas, which publishes a lot of research in this field, said that 64% of CEOs are looking at reshoring a lot of their manufacturing operations. I'm a little bit skeptical of that number, to be honest with you. And I'm skeptical of that number because there are some major benefits to still manufacturing in China. If you look at that chart I showed you before of the 1978, where the United States had the highest number of manufacturing jobs, it also was the peak of our middle class. And since then, we've had an erosion of middle class. Conversely, in countries like India and China, you have burgeoning middle classes. You have a large consumer population. And so and you look at Tesla, for example. Tesla opened up a plant in China to support the domestic consumption of Tesla vehicles in China. So I do believe if you look at the model of locate closer to your customer base, why would you leave China? Instead, what we'll see, I think, is a fragmentized sort of supply chain where you have, of course, you have some footprint in China, but you're looking for that plus one location. Where's that going to be? And I believe very strongly, and I've seen it thus far with companies we're speaking to now, is they're saying we have to look at Mexico as an option. Mexico is ready to go now. They're very they have a large labor force, a lot of manufacturing capabilities, and a low-cost manufacturer. And also they're close. And if you're the CEO of a company and you're saying, where do I locate my next facility? In the past, it's been cost and speed as the primary drivers, but now it's also cost, speed, and also mitigating the risk. Mitigating that risk of disruption in your supply chain when you're making a new facility. So there are a lot of opportunities. I think for Arizona specifically, the advantage you have is that binational agreement with Mexico, being so close to the major manufacturing locations in Mexico. Additionally, I'm based in Southern California, and talking to businesses in California, which aren't probably going to relocate manufacturing jobs to California from Mexico. They're looking for locations which are a little bit lower cost, but still close to markets. Arizona is nicely situated geographically between California and Texas at a lower cost for manufacturing. So I think there's some benefit there, but it's that kind of a triumvirate feel of having the infrastructure in place to hit both markets, plus in Mexico as well. That's the real connection. And of course, 5G is one of the pieces of infrastructure people are looking for as well. Next. This is the brightest spot of the big pivot with COVID-19. And this is the area where every market can grow and every market can change and develop and really connect with its opportunity for growth. Prior to COVID-19, retail sales in the United States, only 11% were online. We peaked in December of 2019 at 14.6%. So low, relatively speaking, to the rest of the world. If you look at my chart here, in China in 2020, this is just prior to COVID-19, we find that they were anticipating about 44% of all retail sales to be online. Incredible amount. And we're seeing this now also, this sudden jump in e-commerce sales in the United States. Things like grocery items, which were considered kind of the last leg to fall when it comes to e-commerce. People are buying things online now. And when we're talking, with our brokers, we know that Amazon's active in 20 markets right now, grabbing whatever they can, additional space to have a larger location strategy, to be closer to consumers. China's looking at being 66% roughly, or 63.9% of their total commerce sales, retail sales online in just 3 years. So the United States is going to definitely shift more in this model here. And that means we'll have more industrial development. It means we have to think about that infrastructure to support e-commerce as well. Our roads, big part of it. Again, back to China, and I work extensively in China. In China, you order something online, 90% of shipments arrive within 24 hours from when you place your orders. So they are definitely well suited for this e-commerce environment. And companies like Alibaba really grew up from the SARS pandemic. So the main point of this is that we will have some substantial shifts in what's going on in industry, but they're not all bad. And we have to just be prepared for that change and be kind of in front of that change. Embrace the revolution, because we can't do anything except for embrace it.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Greg. Yeah, thank you so much. Great information, Greg. And we have a very large audience watching right now, live, engaged, and want to remind everyone that the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, if you want, submit those questions. We'll try to get to them if we can. But, you know, Greg was just talking about, you know, the made in China +1 approach. And one of those locations everybody is looking at is Mexico. So I want to bring in Luis Ramirez right now. In addition to serving as the president of Ramirez Advisors International, Luis has advised the Arizona-Mexico Commission now for over 30 years. Ramirez Advisors is a highly specialized firm dedicated to cross-border opportunities between the U.S. and Mexico. Luis has led multidisciplinary teams on several cross-border projects, including manufacturing site selection, new ports of entry, and more. He does serve on a number of professional and charitable boards and was recently appointed to the National Advisory Council to the EPA as it relates to North American environmental cooperation. So, Luis, with that, and again, on the heels of what Greg was talking about, I'll turn the floor over to you to let you describe what you're seeing and the impact and possibly the resurgence.
Eric, thank you so much. And to both Paul and Greg, thank you. Those were incredible comments. I still want to, I still want to go talk to Greg about the meaning of the word glocalization. I saw it on the slides, and I think you're creating your own words. I mean, you're leading edge. So thank you very much for that. And I know we're running a little bit behind time, so I'm going to try to go real fast through my presentation. Hopefully, we can get more engaged with those watching in a discussion on over issues. If we go to the first slide, it's always important if we're talking about doing business in Mexico to learn a little bit about Mexico. There we go. The economic situation in Mexico right now is pretty dire. Mexico actually in 2019 went through a recession, negative growth, I think for close to three quarters. Certainly we're expecting it to continue on for the first quarter of this year, and then the COVID-19 situation kicked in. And you start seeing, I just picked a few headlines, some projections about the Mexican economy, looking at potentially as much as a negative 12% growth in the Mexican economy. The circle on the left in blue, place that many people like to visit, which is Cancun. Hotels are operating at 4.3% occupancy. Then the Washington headline, Washington Post headline right in the middle, I think sums it up in ways that, brief, the impacts of Mexico is going through. Oil, tourism, remittances, and trade. All those were severely impacted starting in the middle towards late March. And so I wanted to just put that out there. But also, and at the same time, Mexico is looking for the way out of this economic downfall. And I think, embracing the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA, and a close working and trade relationship with the United States, with Canada, I think presents a tremendous opportunity for Mexico. We go to the next slide. The Mexican president, recognizing the situation, has put forward an 11-step austerity program. I'm not going to go through this, but I do want to highlight number 5, which seems to be the one that gets the most attention, which are the areas that are going to continue to get funded through this economic crisis that Mexico is going through, which includes the major projects that the president promised. The airport project, the oil refinery at Dos Bocas in Tabasco, the Mayan train, which is going to cover the Yucatan Peninsula, and also the key one from our perspective is the designation of the border zone as an area that has certain fiscal and overall cost advantages. Next slide, please. So what is the relationship that Arizona has with Mexico and Canada? And I loved Chris's opening remarks, and he said we can even work with California. Well, I'd like to extend that to say we can even work with Canada. The trade relationship with Canada, particularly, this is the information for the first quarter of 2020 compared to the same period in 2019. And the Canada relationship it's growing at a phenomenal rate, 31.4%. That we see that as a continuing trend. Very diverse commodities. I just put the top 3 at the bottom of the slide there for both countries. Mexico did drop by 1%. A lot of that we attribute to the situation that started happening in March, in which supply chains were severely impacted. But again, if you look at the final set of graphics on the right, the opportunity is the trade relationship with Mexico and Canada. And Arizona really has a unique relationship with Mexico, an evolving and growing relationship with Canada, a tremendous opportunity where you're looking at, in the first quarter alone, $6 billion worth of trade that happened between Arizona and those two countries. Tremendous area of opportunity in very diverse areas. Next slide, please. In terms of our border, on March 21st of this year, the U.S. and Mexican governments, in addition, and slightly ahead of that, the U.S. and Canada agreed to a number of restrictions in order to help prevent the continuing spread of COVID-19. The restrictions were outlined initially went on for about 30 days. Then it was extended for another 30 days, which, by the way, that's the second set of 30 days expires on May 19th. So we're still waiting to hear what's going to happen on May 20th. And we're expecting some form of an announcement between the US, Mexico, and even Canada in that sense. And the top chart, the lines, the graphs, the orange line is the first day of the restrictions, and you see dramatic comparison to the before and after. The before is in blue, the after is orange. You saw a dramatic drop in pedestrians, commercial vehicles. But if you look at the last line, at the last set of the pie chart there, or the chart, that the trucks continued to be just about the same as prior to the restriction. And on the bottom right, I like to, I think pictures say 1,000 words, or maybe even more. If you look at the bottom right of the screen, that's a picture from May 12th in Mariposa, which is the commercial crossing at Nogales. So this is, 24 hours old. And you can see the line of trucks. Trade between the US and Mexico is continuing to move in very diverse areas. Initially, the Mexican government was very restrictive in what was determined as or deemed as essential. It truly was only what was food related, fresh produce, value added commodities, and then secondly, anything that was clearly defined as medical. Next slide, please. So we saw, and I'll get into, I love numbers, I'm an economist, so numbers mean, I seem to understand them a little bit better. And here, and Chris may appreciate this as he was in the Yuma San Luis area, this is the volumes of northbound traffic for our ports, the three principal ports of entry connecting Arizona to Mexico: Douglas, Nogales, and San Luis. And we provide the state totals in the bottom, which includes our additional ports at Lukeville, Naco, and Sasabe, which are far smaller. And the story, I think, is told by those red and green arrows. If you look at the green arrows, all the green arrows, except for one, are tied to the growth in truck traffic for the first quarter of 2020. Trade is continuing to move. And that is even with the understanding that the limitations of what could be imported and exported between US and Mexico was limited again to food related, and secondly, medical. That means that aerospace, automotive, defense, mining, a number of other high value sectors that are tremendous clusters in our region went on a standstill. There is continuing work, next slide please, on re-engaging these sectors that were severely impacted. And here you see that two things. One, on the right, a letter by the National Association of Manufacturers, which paralleled communications from the US Department of Defense, asking Mexico to not be so strict on the implementation of what was deemed essential, to really looking at, and the perfect example that was mentioned, there are companies who manufacture electric motors, and they're perhaps a second, maybe even third tier supplier to an upstream manufacturer of ventilators. So that electronic motor, because it was not technically strictly for medical uses, that facility stopped manufacturing because it was not strictly a medical facility. That, and the examples were many and varied. So there is a continued push right now to restart the supply chain, particularly in the manufacturing sector amongst the three North American countries kicking in. And I do want to highlight, which will really impact the comments of the next couple of slides, is that the three countries have now ratified and notified each other of the dates of implementation for the USMCA, which is July 1st. And there's still some questions as to certain provisions of the USMCA, if they're going to kick in on July 1st, or there's going to be extensions, particularly for the automotive sector. And next slide, please. But this is the kicking in of the USMCA has brought attention from the world over to North America. A little bit more narrow focused. Yesterday, the picture in the center and with the orange background, that is literally a picture of Governor Claudia Pavlovich of the state of Sonora in a roundtable discussion. You see the social distancing, of course, and everybody's wearing face masks. A roundtable discussion with Sonora's manufacturing sector. And that's probably the area that impacts the most for what is happening in Arizona. And I do want to highlight that because of the shutdown, because of COVID, 66% of Sonora's manufacturing sector was shut down. There's a possibility that as much as another 12% may open up by next Monday, but these are negotiations that are going on, and we are expecting, as you see on the right by some tweets by the Ministry of the Economy and the Embassy of Mexico in the United States, that President Lopez Obrador will, as early as tomorrow, make an announcement of the reactivation, particularly in the automotive and potentially the aerospace sectors, which will have a tremendous impact on what is going to happen in the supply chains for North America. Next slide, please. But and both Paul and Greg have talked about this, and even Chris, the China connection. I participated in, and loving Zoom and WebEx and all the other video communication technology. Participated in a discussion with several manufacturers and companies in mainland China and Hong Kong. And these are some of the highlights of the discussion that we had. The bottom right, this was now, days are blurring, a little bit of Groundhog Day situation, or probably about 10 days ago. China they're 95% open, factories 93%, and we were never clear on what staff meant because companies are operating at 95%. But China, for most intensive purposes, is back to work and is back in the consumption side. And those were some of the takeaways that we took about the China relationship, the China discussion. One, there's a lot of companies that were simply manufacturing in China, but then re-exporting it back to North America or other markets around the world. That is dramatically changing. And in fact, we're hearing directly from companies in China that they're looking at two things. One, yes, they're selling into this, as we mentioned earlier, rising middle class in China and the consumer market that China represents. But secondly, the manufacturing in China, the Chinese companies are now recognizing that in order to continue to sell to the North American market, they must focus on shortening the supply chain. They can no longer rely on themselves on Chinese supply. If you look at the pie chart on the right, this is the Chinese companies, they were reporting that their number one challenge on their internal supply chains was from other Chinese companies. Chinese companies themselves learned the lesson. They cannot rely on China for their own supply chain networks. Next slide, please. So this is, I want to close off by just presenting to some basic observations from my perspective. And of course, I agree with Governor Ducey, stay home, stay healthy, stay connected. Our health has to remain as a top priority. Regional manufacturing has taken a hit, but it is, I believe, poised for a prompt recovery. There's all this potential of manufacturing capability just across the border from us that is just chomping at the bit to get back into operations. There's an ongoing discussions of what is to be determined as essential manufacturing between the U.S. and Mexico, and I think it'll be gradual but tremendous opportunity for future short-term and long-term manufacturing operations. I think Chinese companies are now looking at North America with a different light. They're no longer just looking to manufacture the cheapest. They're now looking, as we were discussing earlier, the risk factors, the cost factors of getting their product to the U.S. market. And as Ambassador Chris Landau said, we're now in a transformation and a transition of the relationship between China and the U.S. That trade battle is not going away. And in fact, some of the headlines earlier this week indicate that it might be reheating again. So the idea of shortening the supply chain, and if you want to sell into the North American market, you need to manufacture in North America. And again, Chris, I'm going to harp on your initial comment that we can manufacture with Mexico and California. I do want to make sure that we include Canada in that discussion because we do have a much faster and growing relationship with our Canadian partners. So with that, I look forward to our ongoing discussion with the rest of the participants.
Luis, thank you so much. And with that, I'll bring Chris into the conversation. I think it was Paul who said at the end of his presentation, oh, okay, so what does it all mean? And you just were flooded with a load of information there. And from what I heard, actually, despite there being a lot of questions, a lot of good news or a lot of positive news. I heard, the word catalyst, ushering a new era of localism. And again, Arizona seems to be positioned well for this. What is your take after hearing everyone's presentation?
Well, I absolutely think that Arizona's in a great position, and I can't recall if it was Greg or Paul who mentioned this kind of new focus on risk, where cost has always been relevant, labor's been relevant, modern infrastructure matters for advanced manufacturing. What I'm hearing more and more, this is kind of pre-COVID related to advanced industries and kind of heavy asset manufacturing. This was an issue before COVID, but now that we're in COVID times, this focus on risk and redundancy is absolutely critical. And redundancy can mean supply chains, it can mean infrastructure, it can mean people and pipelines, it can mean how goods get into the country through ports, both wet and dry ports or air. So I do think I look on the horizon that, unequivocally our alignment with Mexico matters, our Canadian growth matters. I still, kind of look on the horizon with California and everything I'm hearing, and I saw a question about Tesla, talking about Dallas and these other places. While California, it's a massive consumer market that cannot be denied. And Greg mentioned his SoCal roots or where he lives today. We're seeing this massive number of small, medium-sized manufacturers that are transitioning to the next generation of ownership. And I talk to them, some of them I'm in their age demographic, and so we can have a pretty direct conversation about the math and about risk and about volatility of public policy, about the uncertainty of labor laws, tax and regulatory environment. And when that happens, I mean, these second, third, fourth generation owners, for the first time, I'm seeing them consider, do we move to a more business-friendly market, whether that's Arizona, Nevada, Texas, elsewhere. Now, I also see, as Luis talked about, the Mexico model, which certainly in the last few years has taken some challenging economic impacts. But I also see kind of a trend evolving where, yes, there's a focus on China from an intellectual property protection standpoint. How do I ensure or insulate my risk because of IP protections? We're seeing other parts of Asia emerge as their middle classes evolve, where they can actually move to Philippines, Indonesia, these other areas for manufacturing. But I still think, as Luis closed his comments, that if we believe hyper-regionalism is coming, where whether you're based in Western Europe or Asia and you want to enter the U.S. market, or you have supply chain already existing in the U.S. market, cost is still going to matter because the consumers will only pay so much. And I'd love to hear from the group your views on cost premiums. That used to be 20 to 30% delta on labor. I'm hearing that's changing. And with the 2017 tax program that was passed, are we at that impasse point or inflection point where if you are producing for the U.S. market, economically, I'm curious, does it now fully make sense to be close to that in-game consumer or in-game supply chain base? So I still think there's a lot of questions, but I think we are entering a new time. As we talked about, flare-ups with China will likely continue. And the national rhetoric is still there. And as such, I think we've got to just ensure Arizona is well positioned as we come out of this and making sure that we're still investing in infrastructure. We're constantly evaluating our state policy to ensure that we are as competitive as possible for R&D and advanced manufacturing. And that's what we'll continue to work on with this state administration as well as our partners at Commerce Authority. I mean, that's what we have to look at year in and year out, is how competitive we are. And that chart that Greg showed of the Southeast and the massive amount of investment that's gone from FDI into those Southeastern states, I will tell you, every year I talk to my counterparts there, they're determining how do they create upskilling programs to meet manufacturing needs? How do they create public policy that supports tradable sectors? They're not hiding behind the fact that they are inducing that kind of inward investment into their states. And I feel like we're really well positioned for that as well.
Chris, thank you. And as we get close to wrapping up here, we're going to run out of time for some questions, but I do want to get some final thoughts from the panelists. And, we'll bring back Paul. We haven't heard from you in a while. So Paul, give us your thoughts after hearing everyone's presentation. And again, maybe in reference to Chris's most recent remarks.
Yeah, I mean, I do believe, as I've said before, that Arizona is very well positioned. Particularly if you look through the optic of the fourth industrial revolution, key technologies, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, information, the Internet of Things, 3D manufacturing and robotics, and you look at all of the things that the state has been doing and is doing to try and encourage autonomous vehicles, IoT and 5G, around artificial intelligence and machine learning. You look at the University of Arizona Eller Center on Artificial Intelligence and the ASU Consortium for Science, Policy, and Outcomes. If you look across the state at biotech, if you look at educational technology, I think Arizona has to focus like a laser beam on those sectors of the economy that clearly will be most important for continued competitiveness, not just of Arizona, but of the U.S. And that's going to require a public-private partnership to ensure that the right kinds of policies are instituted to be able to continue to attract the businesses that we need to attract in order to make Arizona capitalize on those benefits that Luis and Greg, I think, and you, Chris, have all referenced correctly.
Paul, thank you so much. And Greg, we'll bring you in now for some final thoughts after hearing everyone's presentation today.
Well, it's a lot going on right now in the world.
Yeah.
So this is I'm calling this a condensing of 10 years of transformation happening in 1 year. So trends that were happening anyway are just being condensed, and we're forced into these changes now. So again, you either embrace the change or you become not relevant anymore. And what we're finding is those locations that have, again, infrastructure, which is not just roads, but also 5G. It's a very important thing for a lot of our customers and clients. Have the infrastructure, have the labor, and have availability to consumer markets. That's a really important thing to find to locate a new facility at. So that's what we're seeing as a main driver of this, and that hasn't changed. That hasn't changed really in that sense. It's just more important than ever at this point.
Yeah, I like that. Trends are condensing. Embrace it. And Luis, let's bring you in now for some final thoughts.
If you look at the example of Lucid Motors and Casa Grande, I think they're the perfect example of what the future paints for Arizona. Yeah, they picked Arizona, but they were also looking at the ability to tap into the automotive sector that exists just across the border. Literally, truck in 8 hours can be from Casa Grande to Hermosillo and another 8 hours back. We have a state-of-the-art border infrastructure. Right now, our trucks are waiting less than 30 minutes to cross the border. Versus the unpredictability of putting something on a ship out of China and arriving, 10, 15 days later into whatever destination is in the US. There's tremendous advantages, and we can spend a lot of time discussing them. Manufacturing in Arizona, combination with Mexico and Canada.
Luis, thank you so much. And as we close here, we still have a very strong audience. So I do want to promote the next regional report will be a two-part series, May 20th at 2 o'clock. Again, a reminder, we will bring together an esteemed panel of leading investors. They will provide perspective about how the pandemic has impacted their investment decisions and what startup and early stage companies can do to weather that storm. And then May 28th, we'll have 4 Greater Phoenix business-based businesses or nonprofits will present their technology and highlight how they have pivoted during their operations and meet the current demands of the COVID-19 pandemic. Those businesses will be vying for a $50,000 grant provided by the Paykiss Center for Business Philanthropy at the Arizona Community Foundation. So you will have to look out for that email coming and register for each webcast separately.